is engaging, that is progressive, that is collaboration oriented, that is fun, and a way to learn about best practices in the field and new methods and to meet people. Okay, so it's one approach to, I think, addressing some of the key problems in developmental science. There's a big problem with ManyBabies right now, okay, which is that those of us who established it are all roughly at the same career stage. In fact, we're all roughly at the same age. In fact, we're all roughly clustered in the same two continents, which are American and Europe. This is a problem, right? And it's one that we are very dedicated to addressing. And that'll come up today as we present, but also we can discuss later. We would love involvement from more people. And the beauty of ManyBabies is it's a horizontal structure as much as human possible, right? Where anybody can make a project would be involved in meaningful ways. So, with that in mind, we really encourage you to share your ideas about how this is done. And there are no slides yet. However, I can say, here's a couple of problems with developmental science. All right, I'm going to go through key ones. First, we have small sample sizes. Okay, N of 20 per condition is very common. Right, and the according to meta-analyses, right, an average effect size for a couple of condition differences in developmental studies, something like Cohen's d of 0.48, which is at best a median effect size. Right, so that's one problem in developmental science. We have low power. Right? And on top of that, we have a tradition potentially of some p-hacking and something called parking, which is kind of pretending that the results you found were hypothesized a priori. Right. This is not something that people do intentionally necessarily, but it's something that kind of has ended up happening. And we need to be able to address this in a meaningful way. So low power is one problem. A second issue, right, is that we don't know if new approaches to methods are, if advances in technology even, are necessary for for addressing a lot of developmental infant-related questions. Are we good now? Cool. Thanks so much, Mike.
Oh, I get to share the screen. Sorry.
Okay.
There's so many things.
So, we have head-turn preference. Okay. We have preferential looking, also known as looking while listening. We have head-mounted eye tracking. Okay. We have eye tracking. The question is, what are the differences between these? People kind of randomly choose to use a method that their lab happens to use, and we don't know if one approach is better than another. That's another problem with the way developmental science is done. So it'd be great to have some consistency and knowledge and robustness behind these different methodological approaches, so we can really choose the best method for the right reasons. And that's the beauty of developmental science, or cognitive science in general, right? We can use whatever tools are best for addressing a research question, and ManyBabies might help us learn about which tools are, in fact, the best. Okay. Hopefully now everybody.
Stay muted.
Stay muted.
You stay muted.
Cool. All right. And well, the last point here is babies, right, are vulnerable populations pretty much universally, but then more so in many regions of the world, especially if they're underrepresented in the traditions of our field. And they're also difficult to recruit, and they're not very compliant. So that's always a bummer. Okay, went through that. So another problem with the way developmental science is done is it's hard to capture developmental change, and there are wild individual differences between kids, as you can see on this plot of vocabulary growth. And even beyond these percentiles, looking at the vocabulary levels of different kids at different ages, you have interactions with environmental effects, such as your birth order, being first, second, third, fourth born, interact with your vocabulary growth. And these all interact together, which is why within any one lab with a small sample size, it's quite challenging to find something meaningful that you can then rely on at the next iteration or when the next study comes around. So individual environmental variation is big. I already went through methods. Here are a few that I'm not covering. We have a lack of diversity at all levels in developmental science, right? With research participants, with research questions, and with researchers. And this has to change. And we also have little to no standardization in the way that things are done, right? I don't know, some labs put darkened sunglasses on parents in an infant study. Some use music to mask parent knowledge of what's going on. Which of those is better, right? We don't necessarily know the answers to these, and that's just one example. And I can tell you, as somebody who's been involved in ManyBabies, for years now, it's been wonderful to connect with people, to actually just have discussions about the ways to do this. And we can be so isolated in our individual labs in our corners of the world and not do this. And this is really an important way of connecting people. Those of you who've been involved have already seen this happen. And then, of course, as Mike so nicely overviewed, we have goals toward increasingly open science and also the creation of best practices in our field. ManyBabies, the vision, right? I can go through this briefly. Mike already overviewed this in such a nice way. The vision here, the reason this was done in the first place was to have a radically collaborative and horizontal framework in a way that, you know what, is kind of a strange mismatch to the incentive structures in academia. And our goal is to really address those. So think about that, right? There is a lot of value to be had in being an author of a paper with 100 authors on it, because there's opportunity to connect and collaborate and learn, right? And get involved in a community in a way that, sure, might not match being first author, and that's it, that's all that matters. But you get so much benefit for a pretty, often minimal time cost. And anybody can lead and contribute, and that's such an important aspect of this. And then, we aim to have large-scale consensus-based conceptual replications of seminal findings. And replication does not mean adopting the methods of paper X and putting it into this one. It means discussing what the best approach will be based on what we know. And also the goal is to identify sources of variation so that we can build better theories and to establish best practices, and then again to increase diversity. And that's how ManyBabies is born. And we address some, but not all challenges in the way infant research or developmental science is carried out. There are many ways to contribute to ManyBabies. You can sign up on the listserv and just get announcements about new projects, about ways to get involved. And it is not required to collect data to be meaningfully involved in a project. It might have sort of been historically, but we've really been rethinking this. There are so many ways to get involved, and we don't want to, make that the key way to become an author on a paper, right, or to get richness out of this. So as you can see in our presentation today, and even on the ManyBabies website, and the new election that we'll be having in a couple of weeks for new board members and new committee members, there are many ways to involve. We basically expect a commitment to core values and a code of conduct, which Heidi Baumgartner and Grace Sue have been addressing in extremely helpful ways for the last year. And there are many learning and growth opportunities. As you'll see, you can apply to be a governing board member or join a committee. You can even yourself, following today, start talking to people and propose a project of interest to you, and then submit it to the ManyBabies governing board, which we also hope will grow in the coming months as well. You can also propose what's called a spin-off project, where there might be a project happening in the ManyBabies structure already, and you can say, wait, I'm really interested in hearing impaired infants. Okay, I wonder if 6 to 10 labs or something would want to join me in recruiting this population. Like, what would the reasons be to do that? Why might that be interesting? How could that enrich this data set? What might we learn from this? Right, and then you can propose an interesting spin-off. So what I'm going to do for ManyBabies 1, and then Kiley Hamlin will take over for the rest, is tell you about some projects we've been up to so far. Sounds like some of you are familiar with ManyBabies activities since 2015-16 is when it started, but many of you are not. And it would be just great to get more folks involved and have a greater range of projects represented, especially with older kids, actually. It's called ManyBabies, but we really don't have many studies with older kids, say, 2 to 5. So ManyBabies 1, it was a project, and I'm really gonna fly through this to make sure Kiley has plenty of time. But we wanted to select a project that did not feel like we were out to get some potentially shaky finding in the field, right? We wanted to really make this a community building exercise. And we had a quite democratic vote process. We had about 6 or 7 different ideas for what we'd address in this first project. And we chose to investigate this pretty decently replicated finding that infants prefer listening to infant-directed speech over adult-directed speech. And it's a pretty reliable finding in the literature. We had some decent confidence that it would probably be replicated and that it would allow us to really explore variation in the ways that were important to us. And there have been not only replications, but some meta-analytic approaches too, which is a really interesting way to think about doing science alongside ManyBabies, because they are in the same spirit often, and they often converge, but sometimes not. So we chose simple and commonly used methods that already exist in many labs, and we even provided some intensive learning opportunities for labs that didn't have these implemented. And there was a go-to person in ManyBabies 1 for different methods. And they could contact that person, learn the details of how to do this in their own space. Infant-directed speech, as you know, is this way that we speak to young infants, and it has all these characteristics. We use shorter utterances, higher and more varied pitch, more repetition, and so forth. And that's in contrast to adult-directed speech, which tends to be rather, monotone, and we might think is not as interesting to tune into when you are a young developing learner. It's thought to be potentially beneficial for language development in various ways, by helping you learn sounds as an on-ramp to language, for example. Or maybe it builds attentional mechanisms in a meaningful way. So here's a short timeline of what we did. In 2015, we had a call for participation. In 2016, we made decisions to basically pursue this topic. In 2017, we had a registered report accepted. We had some results in 2018, and then the stage 2 registered report was accepted in 2019, published in 2020, like one fun activity per year. And these do take a while. Okay, it is truly not straightforward, right, to make one of these projects happen when you follow all best practices and you consult and collaborate and make sure everybody's voice is heard. It takes time, and that's really okay. In this case, it was a 5-year process. I think that's going to be pretty typical. And we had a consensus-based study design. We didn't have information on study-specific methods, so we addressed that. We compared various methods that have been used historically to study this question. We debated with this other sticking point, debated about it, which is what language do you use for a global project, right? Do we use English in every lab throughout the world? And that's what we ended up doing. Or do we expect different labs to record their own stimuli, right? Edit them, learn this. It's a big burden on a lab that might be doing this kind of work for the first time. We erred on the side of making it as straightforward for new labs as possible. And we used English to evaluate the preference for infant-directed speech everywhere. And that is also an opportunity, right, where you can test whether the effect is language specific or if it's much broader. So at least we tell ourselves that was a good perk, but it was a very flawed decision too. Fortunately, it's a spin-off. Hopefully it's gonna happen. There's supposed to be one more. Oh, there it is. We also, wondered, how do you design a best test of this question? And to do that, and this is central to how ManyBabies works, it's important to recruit for the leadership team even people with contrasting views on the question, right? Because then you're not just like steamrolling everybody with, here's how we're going to design it, because you stack the cards in your favor, so to speak, right? But if you consult and you do what is this type of collaboration called with your enemies? Adversarial collaboration, right? That's the best kind of collaboration. When you collect your, 5 academic enemies with contrasting views or whatever, and think about it together. There's some beautiful examples of papers published in psychology where, the people coming together generated some of the best stuff. And then turns out they were friends, all of them. Okay, so we used central fixation, we used eye tracking, we used head turn preference. We had a sample from what you could say a lot of places, and you could say is still woefully over-sampled in North America and Europe. But in the end, a sample of over 2,000 infants in a study, which is a big achievement. There were all these steps toward actually implementing this, and I might just sort of skip through this quickly and say, when lots of labs collect data, they have to be merged. Okay, that might seem kind of straightforward, like, I don't know, send them a Google, send them an Excel, have them insert stuff there, send it back. It's not that straightforward at all, because it's different methods. It's people with tons of expertise or very little in this particular kind of work, and it's a lot of work to pull this together. And then even converging on the right analysis part is a challenge. So there's a lot of data related challenges here. In the end, what did we find? Babies did generally prefer infant-directed over adult-directed speech, but with a much smaller effect size than implied by a meta-analysis. Okay, so the D was 0.35 in our study, it was 0.67 in the meta-analysis, but it seems real and robust. There was change over development, where older infants in this study showed a larger preference, and growing up with an English environment was linked to a larger preference as well. And you can see that sort of eyeballing it, that effect size on the left half is a little bit higher than on the right, with the left being North American English infants who are hearing North American English versus the other side where they are not. turns out for this particular research question, with this pretty wonderful sample, method mattered too, where we got stronger effects for in the head turn preference procedure than in others. So that was really interesting. Maybe that generalizes to other sorts of attention-based preferences, or maybe it doesn't. Okay, but it seems to be that we got a larger effect size with head turn preference over central fixation, which is kind of a big screen in front of you or an eye tracker. There were lots of outputs on for this project, not only the paper, right, but also a wealth of materials available on OSF and on GitHub. And those are forevermore available to those who are interested. And beyond the main project, parallel projects happened. Here's one, a bilingual project. ManyBabies 1 bilingual, where people had various reasons, which I won't dive into now, for why it might be interesting to compare bilingual infants to English-speaking infants. And look at this timeline in blue, okay? Around the same 4 to 5 years that ManyBabies 1 was happening, the ManyBabies 1 bilingual project was happening. And so that's an example of how a parallel project can take place. And if you don't want to kind of take the big leap of proposing a big giant ManyBabies project, you know, to the organization, this is a fun way to think about it as an entry point. You might have a question of interest and know some folks who might also be interested in addressing it. And in short, exposure did matter. All I'll kind of say, and then I'll move on, is that the more English you hear, the stronger the effect was if you're a bilingual participant. Okay. My last slide here, that Kiley's taking over. Look at all these spin-off projects that emerged from people's enthusiasm for different, you know, kind of surrounding questions around the infant-directed speech preference. We have a question about gaze following that was added onto this. Test-retest reliability. What happens if you bring the same babies back? Do they show the same effect as last week or not? There's a longitudinal project to see if the infant-directed speech preference predicts vocabulary development. There are comparisons to a meta-analysis. What explains the difference between these? There has been an effort led by Alex Karstensen and George Kuchergis that is extending the sample to 10 labs of collaborators on the African continent. So we had a workshop in Nairobi that was really amazing. Not only did we get to hear about the research questions being carried out in, you know, parts of the world that we hadn't really had much contact with before, right? But also we were able to meet new folks, exchange ideas about methods, and hopefully this in the end will create some really neat opportunities to broaden the kinds of questions we ask. And then there was an effort to re-record stimuli across languages and compare that, but COVID really slowed down that much. Kind of wanted to remember. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Casey. I usually teach with my mask on, but since everyone's taking theirs off, I'm going to do that too. Okay. So Casey's just introduced ManyBabies and told us about our first project, which is to date our sort of only beginning to end full ManyBabies project, but there are many others that are in different stages of completion that I just want to sort of quickly review. And as Casey mentioned, MB1, or infant-directed speech, was really a sort of proof of concept. Like we all got together and said, this is something we think babies do, like let's see if we can do this at scale. And now the idea is, can we move on to more sort of controversial or sort of theoretically, controversial questions as a group at scale. Okay, so the first study in this regard is infant theory of mind. I'm assuming that people at this conference know that whether infants and very young children have, okay, we're good, okay, something going wrong. Have a representational theory of mind is hotly debated in the field. And there's lots of reasons why that's true. There are sort of conceptual disagreements about positive evidence that does exist. There's replication concerns, there's methods issues, et cetera, et cetera. So the question is, can infants actually predict how someone will act on the basis of their representation of the world? And how we did this is a bunch of experts from both sort of sides of the debate got together and said what would be a test case that we would all agree is an effective test of infants' ability to do this. And we ended up with professionally animated modular stimuli that can be presumably used to ask many different sub-questions as well as the sort of ultimate question. So I'm just going to show you what a familiarization trial of these events look like. So there are tiny animal sounds happening right now that you can't hear, but they're just like footsteps and things like that. What will he do? Cool. So this is a familiarization trial where no representational mental state understanding is required because the bear sees the mouse going into the box and pursues him, and it's true in reality that he's in the box where he last saw him be in the box and things like that. But there are many other kinds of trials made in which that various things are varied. Basically, this is a study of toddlers, so 18 to 27-month-olds, in a pilot study where we had like actually quite a large sample relative to usual studies. We found that the familiarization trials themselves reliably elicit anticipation. This is actually not a small feat because many of the replication issues may or may not rest on the fact that sometimes getting toddlers to anticipate anything is hard, whether it's mental state relevant or not. So thankfully, these trials do reliably elicit anticipation. Now we can move on to asking the sort of theory of mind questions. So we have a registered report accepted and data collection is about to begin, where we're going to ask a question about knowledge versus ignorance. So if the bear is not aware of the location of the mouse, will they behave differently or predict differently than when they are aware? Will infants predict differently than when the bear is aware of where the mouse is? Assuming that goes well, and there's a lot less controversy about whether infants can succeed at those kinds of tasks. Assuming that goes well, we'll move on to the sort of ultimate question of false belief. Okay, but the idea is that these are sort of modular stimuli that can all be sort of cribbed together to ask more and more complex theory of mind questions, and hopefully can be used in other studies down the road that might modify things in other small ways. Okay, so that's MB2. Data collection for the knowledge versus ignorance contrast is about to begin. COVID has made everything, about to begin. What does that mean? I don't know. So the next project is rule learning. And basically the idea is, can infants learn abstract algebraic rules based on patterns of stimuli that they hear? So for example, if they hear a series of syllabi where there's an A, B, B pattern, like ku, pi, pi, mu, fa, fa, lo, mi, ni, etc., can they sort of generalize that pattern to a new set of stimuli? So will they look longer, listen longer when they hear an inconsistent pattern, like lo, ni, lo, versus a consistent pattern like lo, ni, ni. And sorry, I should say that lo, ni, ni, importantly, isn't in the familiarization set. So all the test stimuli are, in fact, novel, but the question is, one follows the pattern and one shows a new pattern. Can they detect this? So this study will test 5 to 12-month-olds, and their registered report has been, revisions were invited and those have been submitted. So hopefully is in the very final stages where data collection will be able to begin relatively soon. MB4 is a question of social evaluation in infants. And the question being, do infants have a preference for pro-social agents, helpers, over antisocial agents, hinderers? Like in other areas in the field, there are replication concerns in this area, as well as conceptual disagreements about the positive results that do exist. So basically, this project is a video-based replication to make it easy for labs to produce of the hill paradigm that originally showed babies prefer helpers to hinderers. But we made it a bit better, so we removed some of the potential perceptual confounds that existed in the original study. And we changed our control condition to be a little bit more tightly controlled than the one was in the original study. And again, here we're about to begin data collection ASAP, and that's with 6 to 11-month-olds. ManyBabies 5 is designed to sort of better understand what makes infants attend to things. And as we presumably are all familiar with, a traditional prediction in the literature is that you sort of familiarize or habituate babies to something, and then they will look longer at something novel, right? Whether it's conceptually novel or perceptually novel or novelty in any form, babies will look longer at the novel thing. That's all well and good, but then sometimes you end up with actual results that have the reverse effect, where babies will look longer, in fact, at the familiar or conceptually consistent thing, which is not what was predicted. So way back when Hunter and Ames proposed a model of infant attention that basically said that there's at the beginning you like familiarity, right? As you're exposed to something early on, you like familiar things, like a song we've heard maybe once before, like, oh, that's catchy, it's familiar. And then the more and more and more you're exposed to it, you eventually like novel things because you get really bored with the original thing, right? However, the empirical evidence for this sort of initial familiarity preference, eventual novelty preference is mixed in many ways. And this is the kind of question that really lends itself or really requires huge numbers of babies at different ages being exposed to different amounts of stuff during familiarization in order to really sort of dig into this question of what exactly drives infant attention. So we think that this is one of the ways in which a ManyBabies approach could address a question uniquely or sort of way better than the individual lab approaches ever could. Potentially individual labs would never be able to address the question in the way that a ManyBabies project could. So we're very excited about this one. And basically this paper, the register report, is about to be submitted, and fingers crossed that it will get in, and then we'll start collecting data. Okay, then we have two sort of methodological projects going on that I'm going to mention together because they're really, really related. One is called ManyBabies at Home, which is basically online testing of babies in the home. And the other is ManyBabies Many Webcams, which is about automated eye tracking, presumably of babies at home, but also potentially babies in your lab when you don't want to spend $75,000 on a commercial eye tracking system. There's a lot of things on this slide, but basically, ideally, we would have a sort of readily available open source system for testing babies, kids, adults even potentially in the home that would not require in-depth technical knowledge, coding, hardware, et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot of people, many of whom you're going to hear from today, who are all interested in this question. And ManyBabies at Home is one of several endeavors to try to make something like this happen. In particular, Many Webcams is interested in the question of automated look coding. And I won't say any more because there's a symposium on these ideas and specifically a talk on MB Many Webcams on Saturday. So if you're interested in this, I highly recommend going and you can get some info about how to not spend $75,000 in your lab. But there's some complicated stuff that's coming up with ManyBabies at Home, and I think indeed across all of these projects, which is that we want to share data, right? We all want to bring our data together and answer big questions, but stuff where you require videos of infants in order to do that brings up a huge number of ethical concerns. Many of us have spent many tens or more of hours talking to ethics officers at our universities, trying to figure out how we can make video sharing work. across, say, North America versus Europe that have incredibly different rules about how to share data, and that's just North America versus Europe, right? So lots of complications arising in terms of video data sharing, which Rick probably knows tons about, being involved in data query, et cetera. Anyway, I will move on there. Okay, one more sort of methodsy project is called MB Demographics. And the idea for this project is to work toward a demographic form for MB projects and indeed developmental projects in general that is unified, where we can imagine getting the same questions answered across studies happening around the world. Standard questions would allow us to pool a massive amount of data together to see whether specific demographic variables do or do not predict outcomes of interest, right? But a lot of complications arise with that sort of stuff, like how is ethnicity documented in different cultures? What kinds of questions are okay to ask? What kinds of questions aren't okay to ask? Just like a massive amount of complications arise from these sorts of projects, even though I think we can all agree that it would be great in order to be able to combine data sets in this way. So this team has created core materials for the sort of basic standard stuff you might want to ask in all of your projects, like language exposure, SES, this kind of stuff. And these are currently being piloted. And by piloted, I mean people in the field are saying, around the world are saying, could I use this? And like, would this work for me? And then, so the paper on the basic stuff is drafted and being actively revised based on this piloting, but the future goal is to add more questions that you could sort of choose if they were relevant to your own project and customize them for your particular setting, et cetera. So I think this is an exciting project that will hopefully help us all do bigger, better science. Okay, so that is the sort of explanation of ManyBabies projects that are in progress. And I'm just gonna spend the last few minutes sort of referring back to some of the stuff that Casey brought up. ManyBabies projects, and I think other developmental big team science projects, big team science in general, have the key ideas are that we want to bring together people to test key theoretical questions, right? And improve the methods by which we do that. So the things that are really important to us as a group are that we don't replicate things that are not worthy of being replicated. So we bring experts together, again, who are potentially adversaries on a topic, and we ask them to agree on what the best test of a particular phenomenon would be, and to sort of sign off on, yes, if the data turns out like this, I will be convinced by that. And so that's really important to us, and sometimes is quick, right? And sometimes takes years. So our different MB projects have had different stages where we're sort of at that stage of what is the best test of a particular phenomenon. We also are hoping to explicitly study methods effects. So we know that different labs use different methods, and we can capitalize on that and say, with really large data sets, we have the opportunity to see whether our idiosyncratic methods choices actually matter for, say, the effect size of a particular study. And Casey talked about how, at least in the case of MB1, it did seem to. And finally, methodological innovation. We can make it easier for everyone around the world to test babies at scale through, say, automated looking, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so this is related, but we can then develop our consensus-based best practices for studying development. There's lots of spin-off projects available. And what is also key is that we really are interested in not just being a bunch of people all around the age of 39, I don't know how old you are, Casey, but who lead these projects. And so we can have a sort of horizontal framework where anybody could propose a project, propose a spin-off, lead a project, be on the governing board, that kind of thing. And this will, of course, require that we rethink reward structures. The number one question I get asked is like, should my students do these kinds of projects? And if they do, like how much of their time should they spend on these kinds of projects? And I think that those are important questions and ones that we need to like come up with good answers to. But also, you know, maybe one of the answers is like, well, yes, of course we should be doing these kinds of projects, and let's figure out why academia says that we shouldn't, right? Anyway, so many ways to contribute. You don't need to collect data in order to be an important contributor to these projects. Okay. But we have some ongoing challenges. So we are less diverse than we need to be. We're constantly trying to improve this, but it is not trivial. Funding has been challenging, although not impossible, but we do spend a lot of time and effort trying to get funding, and we're only sometimes successful. That's true for everyone, but there are some disagreements in the field about the value of these big team science approaches. And finally, as I mentioned before, ethics, not only with things like sharing video, which is of course really complicated, but we're testing vulnerable populations potentially around the world. And yeah, so ethics is complicated. Okay, so here's what we've done so far for our inclusivity goals. Currently, we have 484 MB collaborators and potentially a whole host more of the people who are going to sign up to collaborate with us after they've heard our very engaging talk, from 237 institutions in 45 countries. So we're excited about the fact that we have this much diversity thus far, and really just want to keep improving that, because while we have numbers of labs around the world, obviously the representation is still quite biased. One thing we're also doing to sort of potentially increase inclusivity is developing mentoring networks within our individual projects thus far. We've piloted this with MB5, and it's going great as far as I can tell. But basically senior members of the team agree to mentor junior members of the team, ideally ones that they would have never sort of met or interacted with otherwise. And I'm a mentor currently, and it's one of my favorite meetings every month because we just sort of meet on Zoom and chat about random ideas, and yeah, it's quite fun. Okay, funding. We've had a large number of unsuccessful applications, too many to put on the slide, but a growing number of successful ones, and we have a few under review. Thankfully, we've been sort of fighting, and the funding agencies are taking some notice that this is the kind of work that they should be funding. Although exactly how to make it work for different calls for funding is always a fun challenge. In particular, I just want to mention one grant that we have that we're excited about because it's relevant to the sort of overall point of this day. And in fact, the grant is funding some of this day, which is a Network of Networks grant from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. Basically, the idea is to form a partnership amongst a bunch of big team science networks, where we all get together and we say, hey, we have this problem where, you know, how do we get people to abide by rules? And we're like, well, we've drafted a code of conduct where people have to sign it. Like, let's share it with you. So the main idea is to just sort of get together, learn from each other, stop reinventing the wheel in terms of creating and recreating all of the systems that are common in terms of what we need to do this science well. And to hopefully identify particular needs and then develop the infrastructure that could be commonly used to meet those needs. So currently we have only a few official partners, the Psych Science Accelerator, ManyPrimates, which you can get the idea of what ManyPrimates does, and the Center for Open Science, but we're going to be resubmitting a much larger grant very soon, where we'll hopefully add new partners. So maybe they can be you. Okay, so that's ManyBabies to date. We are, just to wrap up, I just want to say how people in this room could get involved if they were interested. You could join an existing project. So MB2, MB3, and MB4 are all looking for data collectors. Obviously, not everyone has access to babies at different ages, but if you do, we would love to have you. MB5 is sort of in the design writing phase, and so is even in an earlier stage where you could get involved, and there are still many ways to contribute to that. We're currently reviewing a proposal on neonatal imitation, so we're excited about that as potentially our MB6, and we'll see how that goes, but that'll be a really exciting project that's right at the beginning. So if you're excited about that topic, definitely, potentially, that will be something you can get involved in soon. You could also say, like, none of these projects interest me at all, and I want to organize a new project, propose a new project, maybe something with older kids, not any older than like 5, right? They're adults, no, just kidding. But there's a project proposal form on our website. Anybody can propose a project to us, so we really welcome new ideas. You could also join our leadership team. So we're having elections coming up. Nominations are due by May 11th, and then the governing board will select amongst the nominations, and we will have a vote. We have spots on our governing board, which is a 3-year renewable term, so renewable up to twice. And that's a sort of at least sort of monthly meetings and being heavily involved in all aspects of ManyBabies. We having a student advisor slot on our governing board where it's just a 1-year commitment, but we really want to always have the student voice on the board in order to have that sort of diversity of experience and opinion on the board. So we welcome applications for that. And then we have several committees that are being formed as we get bigger and bigger. And so there will be spaces on those committees as well. So keep your eyes out for our nomination, posts, emails, and please do vote in the election if you're a member. All right, that is all. Thanks, everybody.